All right, we got another new Pseudcast for everybody. We have had all these great episodes. We just did one with Joe about the history of public education in the United States, and we have done some great ones, JFK assassination. Now we got like a big one. I had to bring Logo in because he's like my resident, guy who's always talking about McLuhan and Lyndon Larouche, and now we actually got the man himself. We got Mark Stahlman, who runs the Center for the Study of Digital Life, who is I'm extremely qualified to talk about these things. I don't even know. You're like an important player, even. So thank you, Mark, for coming and speaking to us.
I'm very glad to be here and to spend some time with the two of you. This should be fun.
It's great. I don't even know where to start. I mean, if you look for Mark Stahlman on a search engine, not much. A lot different things come up of articles you've written and stuff, but I guess they won't let you have a Wikipedia article or something like that. So
it turns out that in order to have a Wikipedia biography nowadays, this was not always the case, but nowadays you must be notorious.
Yeah, they use Wikipedia now as a politicized engine to whenever any controversial person, like if you're a right-wing Republican figure, media person or whatever, you have to have a whole war on the Wikipedia page over whether or not they say you're a white nationalist, and that's has totally taken over the purpose of Wikipedia. So you do have to be infamous, I guess.
Well, if you've ever tried to copy a page on Wikipedia, you'll notice that you can copy all of the stuff on top, but you can't copy the footnotes.
Oh, really? I've never tried that.
It turns out that Wikipedia is just a collection of footnotes, and they consider that to be their intellectual property. Notorious here would mean that somebody has to have noticed me and independently written about me, and they want a lot of that to allow a biography. I have done my best to avoid being notorious. I am BIG, but not notorious.
It's all a huge kind of feedback loop, a self-sustaining cycle of, media sources talking about you, and then you get reported one place, and then another place reports on the report, and then that, it goes in a big circle, and that's how you get legitimate in our society for some reason. But I mean, you have had an amazing life. I don't even know like half the things. I mean, I want to talk about one thing in particular is Lyndon Larouche. Because I feel like everybody's kind of buzzing about Larouche now these days. Like I'm seeing his, everybody bringing up his name all the time, and you have had some experience with that and working with him and his organization or being connected with them.
Yeah, I would summarize that in my case. I'm sure other people would have something else to say about it, but in my case, I use the Larouche organization as a graduate school. I dropped out of 2 PhD programs. This is a long time ago for your listeners, probably before many of them were born.
Well, maybe we could start out more basically, like, who is Lyndon Larouche? If you could give like a...
I really have no interest in describing any of that because you're interviewing me.
No, I know, but I just want the background of like...
And I'm quite happy to describe my involvement, if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Good. That's where I was going. I dropped out of a couple of graduate programs. I studied Old Testament theology at the University of Chicago. And then I joined a program at the University of Wisconsin in molecular biology, only to notice that the NSF, this was 1970s, so federal funding was dramatically cut down. And so I moved to New York and wound up going to another graduate school, which was part of something called the National Caucus of Labor Committees. This is an aspect of Larouche that probably isn't very well understood, but he collected, I would say, probably the more intellectual side of the 60s and 70s New Left, and then put together a whole series of classes. A lot of them were on classic literature. A lot of them were on art, in particular music. And that was my primary interaction with these folks. And this has now come full circle. The Center for the Study of Digital Life that I now run is in the process of setting up our own graduate school. It'll be called The Classics, and I'm hoping we have more to report on that over the course of the next couple of months.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about that on the last show that we did about kind of the environment that the whole educational project in the United States is in right now. It's all kind of messed up on not only the K through 12 level of everybody not having a babysitter anymore for their kids and the problems that's causing, but obviously for a while now, a lot of the higher ed institutions, it's all headed for bankruptcy, and a lot of the 50% or something of the colleges in the United States are probably going to go bankrupt in like the next decade. So now it's like, you're a good time for educational entrepreneurs. But if you want to talk more about like what it's because it's interesting that every kind of organization, whether it be LaRouche or the Center for the Study of Digital Life or anything like that, they all, there's a need for education to be kind of central to the mission of a lot of these different organizations who are trying to confront aspects of modern life, aspects of the control of our modern life by propaganda or systems of influence or intelligence organizations or anything. It's not even a political matter. It's just like if you want to actually deal with those things, it's almost in a way like more centrally an educational project more than it is anything else.
It's very important to notice here that there is no modern life anymore. And so we'll get in to the larger topic of environments, and in particular psychotechnological environments, I think in this call, but we're not doing modern anymore or postmodern anymore for that matter. And that's what really opens up the opportunity here. Psychological warfare, which was a natural derivative of experimental psychology beginning in the late 19th century, that is also no longer as powerful as it once was. It kind of was associated with that whole modernity project, which in McLuhan terms would be called the electric environment. And we're simply not doing that anymore.
No, that's a really good point that you make about. I've been looking a lot into 19th century psychology too. I mean, I'm sure you're way farther along in that than myself. But we were talking a bit about like looking into Franz Brentano. I understand that you said that before you were reading up on him.
Brentano is a pivotal figure, to be sure, in all of this.
Not well known, but this is a fascinating thing for me that I've been learning about.
But the underlying point here is that when the print environment, which had really begun to catch hold in the middle of the 16th century in Western Europe, when that print environment was being replaced by the electric environment in the 19th century. So this is the topic, if you will, of McLuhan's first major book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, The Making of Typographic Man, published in 1962. That environment was already long gone. It had become, in certain senses, a content of the new invisible environment of electricity. And it was under those electric conditions that something radical happened. Obviously, psychology, which is to say the study of the psyche. Psyche is a Greek word. The equivalent English word is soul. So soulology would be the English version of this. By the time we got to the end of the 19th century, almost 2,000 years worth of relatively consistent faculty psychology, faculties of the soul, was discarded for a primary reason that I've just written about in an essay that probably won't appear for a month or two now. It's part of a larger collection. We've put together at my center a roughly 200-page collection, title of which is Ecology of the Inner Senses. So there's a bunch of new essays there. There's a bunch of reprints there. It's going to be, I think, quite exciting, hopefully interesting, broadly speaking, because the psychology that came before experimental psychology has largely been forgotten. Those who should have carried it forward in the 20th century didn't do that. So we are now retrieving the older faculty psychology. But what I say in this essay, the title of which is The Inner Senses and Human Engineering, is that experimental psychology discarded the human soul and instead turned the human into an experimental subject, the purpose of which was to change the human. So human engineering, therefore, is in the title.
You're like speaking my whole language, man. Now I'm getting excited.
Yeah, well, that effort is now over. We're not doing that anymore. And so understanding the environment that we've come from is very important, but it's much more important to understand the environment which we are in today, the digital environment, which has been shaping our lives in many significant fashions for 20 years now. So this is not a matter of looking far into the future. It's already happened.
No, absolutely. This is like one point that I always try to stress is that in a lot of ways, empirical psychology, like that's a fabrication. It's sort of like, the way that I look at it is that you have your actual, soul in the sense of what you're saying as faculty psychology, which, I totally agree with. People don't know exactly what that means, but that's a whole tradition, that goes back, to Aristotle, that has to do with like the different powers of the soul, and that becomes secularized in, classical metaphysics into the idea of like the mind. And it's all about these different powers of, your imagination and your memory and your reason. And that is a whole development that happens where if you start with Francis Bacon, he is, working with these three basic faculties. And then by the time you get to Kant, it's like he has an entire system that's like extremely detailed and worked out that's, very elaborate from those three basic ones. So it undergoes a whole process of analysis in the 18th century. And that's one of my main points that I try to stress and focus on is that, there's a lot of relationship between philosophy. Like philosophy is not incidental, I think. And that philosophy actually, has a real relationship to the nature of consciousness in different eras. And that, philosophy is almost like the way that consciousness expresses itself, if that makes sense.
Well, let's be a little bit careful here with the language we use.
Yeah. Well, it's a hard thing to talk. It's the way that I look at it is classical metaphysics. It's a whole process of reason becoming self-aware. That's the whole development of it. It's it's like in all these books. It's like reason is reasoning about itself. It moves from reasoning about other things, and then it becomes critical of itself.
So I'll point to a few references here that may be useful. Precision in terms of the language we use to describe these faculties or powers of the soul.
Do you think that they're real? Oh, I just want to ask. Do you think that it's a first order division of the soul or a second order division? I mean, what's the perspective of like class or ancient Aristotelian metaphysics? Is it transcendental, or do you view it as like a primary first order division?
Well, it's actually going back to Aristotle. As you know, Aristotle's metaphysics is based upon what is now typically called hylomorphism. Hylo being a Greek word for wood, and morph being a Greek word for shape. the way this is usually treated today is matter and form. Matter is not transcendental. Form, depending on how you're using the term, might be thought of as being transcendental. It's the combination of matter and form that underpins all of what Aristotle was saying. And so, in particular, the human soul is the form of our species. But there are many other souls, and these other souls have different forms. They wind up generating different creatures. The reference that I'd like to point you to was a relatively recent English language translation of Aristotle's 4th century BC. In Greek, it would have been peripsyche. The usual term is the Latin name for it, de anima. And in English, it's simply on the soul. So a great books fellow from St. John's, Annapolis, Joe Sachs. Turns out he's not Joseph, he's Joe. I actually spoke with him about this. And he has translated much of Aristotle into English over the course of the last couple of decades, and it is by far the best translations available. So his translation of On the Soul is where this has to begin. And in fact, at my center 2 summers ago, we did a 13-week intense close read class on the soul. And as I've looked around the world to Oxford and Princeton and Yale and so forth, I believe that was the most detailed reading of de anima, if you will, that has happened in recent history, if not even longer than that. And so that's the place where this has to start.
Yeah, that's very believable. That I don't think that, especially, it's not going to happen at the undergraduate level, but even at the graduate level, I mean, I imagine that there's not that much focus on any sort of seminar on that.
There's zero focus on it, as it turns out, because the only people who really could have brought this understanding into the 20th century would have been the Roman Catholic Church. They did not do that. The reasons why the church abandoned faculty psychology are interesting on their own, but the fundamental reason is that in the early 20th century, the church found itself in what it described as a modernist crisis. That led to some fairly radical activities as they circled the wagons. And in that process, which lasted from the early 1900s into maybe 1920 or so, Pope Pius X is particularly closely associated with this. And in that circling the wagons, the church wound up only dealing with things that were highly regularized as dogma. And so since this whole topic of faculty psychology was never made dogmatic by the church, it was abandoned in that whole process. And many people, Brentano among them, shares some complicity in the confusion that led to that decision. But the net of it is that a careful examination of faculty psychology has not been available to the general interested reader in psychology for probably 150 plus years or so.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the first book that was translated on the topic of psychology into Japanese and Chinese, both languages of which did not have a word for psychology. The book that was translated came out of Amherst, Massachusetts. The author's name is Joseph Haven, Haven. The title of his book, Amherst being a rival to Harvard in the mid-19th century. The title of his book is Mental Philosophy. So what that indicates, obviously, is that psychology and philosophy were closely wed until they weren't. And the separation of the two of them, which began in the 19th century, was probably finally made official when Harvard split the psychology and philosophy departments in 1933. So it took that long. But to be precise about the terms involved here is going to require a fair amount of work. And in particular, what we refer to as consciousness is a very inexact way to describe what's going on here. In particular, in Joe Sachs's On the Soul, he goes out of his way, because he's had to deal with the ancient Greek, to make a glossary of the various terms. And he has a list of roughly 20 different terms used by Aristotle to describe aspects of what we're talking about here. In modern language, it probably would be appropriate to say, it would improve a little bit our precision on this, to indicate that most of what goes on here and most of what we should be interested in is subconscious. It is not a part of what we think of as conscious awareness, but rather something that Freud, who was a student of Brentano's, is given credit for having discovered an unconscious. In fact, humanity has known for a very long time about the subconscious, which is where these powers, particularly the inner senses, operate.
Yeah, but this is like this is like an extremely important kind of history that nobody has gone into much detail about. If you read from like psychology, books written by psychologists today, they can't really grapple with history before the invention of their field.
Right.
And the period that we're kind of talking about, first of all, in the late 19th century with Franz Brentano, that's a very fruitful period. It's very rich because not only does Brentano, he is a teacher of Freud, right? And so that goes on to start, the psychoanalytic tradition, but there's, we have to distinguish between all these more particular traditions as well. And there's also, experimental psychology, which is Wilhelm Wundt is the first guy who develops that, right?
Well, Wundt is actually far more interesting than that. He's usually described.
No, I know he was I'm just saying he was he's coming from like a more neo-Kantian background where Brentano wasn't, and Wundt was a research assistant of Helmholtz, and there's also other students of Brentano who are working on developing Gestalt psychology, and then there's a really deep history in the philosophy of how all these different things sort of came about, and that's but my point is that if you look at some of these books that are available, like Kurt Danziger, I don't know if you've read any of his work, but he has several books about history of psychology. It's like he always starts in the 18th century. He always, kind of starts from the beginning of empirical psychology. He doesn't have much familiarity at all with the idea of faculty psychology. He can't. That's never in the books.
No, he has no clue about it, and there's a whole library of works about various aspects of the history of psychology that miss this, and so for those who are listening, who are interested in forgotten knowledge, I would put this at the top of the list. There's all kinds of foolishness that people chase, imagining sacred geometries and so forth, which may have some historic relevance in some places, but much of what happens in our times when people are trying to find something that was deliberately set aside, they wind up going down rabbit holes that are largely useless. The human soul is the secret, if you will, in all of this. And understanding the composition and capabilities and differences amongst different souls. This is probably the single largest category of forgotten knowledge, which now needs to be retrieved.
Yeah, well, this is like an overall really relevant topic, because I just don't want to talk about like that, a very anachronistic, little part of history. The way that I conceive of this is that this is like, all of human history is wrapped up in this, and that in the modern day, this is super relevant because, if you look at the history of polls, of empirical psychology, this is a big part of what you are talking about with the electric, sort of consciousness with the electric environment, is that it's all predicated and based on a certain type of psychology that came about in a very particular way in a particular historical circumstance. And before that, you go and you look at what there was a specific moment. It's with Kant, and he is focusing on this what he understands as empirical psychology, which is faculty psychology, and he's working from Alexander Baumgarten's book Metaphysics, and he is saying over and over again that this all philosophy is based on empirical psychology, and that never changed through his whole career. And he is a big figure in the development of anthropology. And one of the last books he puts out is a book called Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View. And it begins with a section on empirical psychology. And any scholar who reads this today, you can find, books about this, like Kant, Herder, and the Birth of Anthropology is one. And the author is a very, very good scholar and is trying to actually figure out this particular problem, which they don't quite succeed at. But, they're trying to find, like, what is Kant even talking about when he's talking about empirical psychology? Why is he placing such an emphasis on it? Because if you look at the anthropology, you read the first part of it, the whole thing is just like, it feels completely out of date, worthless, and anachronistic, old, boring, and nobody cares about it. Nobody reads it. Everyone just dismisses it. But the way he's working from this basic form versus matter distinction, and this idea, there's a part of us that, it's based exactly what you're talking about in this sort of Aristotelian kind of distinction, and then working out, how these different powers and how material and form interact with each other, and which parts of the soul deal with which.
I'd be very interested to learn more about that. The Kant that I've read is probably the usual survey class version of Kant. I know there's much more involved in that, so if you want to point me to something that discusses that. But by the time we get to Kant, my suspicion is that faculty psychology, in particular as it was understood by Thomas Aquinas, has largely been thrown away.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. And that's like exactly one of the things he's trying to address, because, we would go back to like Montaigne's essays is a really important beginning part of it, with him being considered kind of like the forerunner of quote unquote experimental psychology, and that it's all based on, introspection. And it's based on kind of these radical literary forms. So it's even tied into the media ecology and publishing and different forms of communication, because it is based a lot around different genres of psychological introspection that start coming about, and writing correspondence, writing diaries, writing essays. Starting with as far back as Montaigne, and this becomes the dominant view of psychology as time goes on and into the 18th century, and you get all this confessional literature and things of that nature that come to dominate how people view our ability to kind of like know about what's going on in our soul, and how we represent ourselves and like make our soul into like an empirical phenomenon. And sort of like Kant is like actually trying to make a really hard break with that and say, no, those kinds of representations are, phantoms, and you can't really know them in a meaningful way. And what we really need to focus on is this, faculty psychology, knowing the dimensions of the soul and what its powers are.
I'd be fascinated to learn more about that. The comment I was making before about environments, and if you will, the quote that is often attributed to Marshall McLuhan inaccurately, "We shape our tools and thereafter they shape us." That was actually a phrase generated by John Calkin, who had brought McLuhan to a sabbatical in 67, 68 at Fordham. But in any event, the sentiment is the correct one. And so it's this, thereafter they shape us. Shape is a very important word to use in English here because it corresponds to the Greek word morphe. And that in turn refers to the whole topic of forms. It isn't just that faculty psychology has been forgotten. It is equally that causality has been forgotten. And a significant part of the reason for that is because forms have been forgotten. Forms can't be measured. So to the extent that empiricism took over under electric conditions, threatening to do that certainly under print conditions. So Kant is a print figure dealing with the rest of the effects of print. And so it makes sense, indeed, that there would be some people who'd be raising objections to all of this. The poster boy, of course, for going all in on the print set of biases is Rene Descartes. Descartes' very first work, and it may be also useful to underscore here, that Kant was actually trained by Jesuits at the first Jesuit college, La Flèche, in France. Interestingly enough, perhaps, David Hume wrote his first inquiry in that same library. He was at the La Flèche Library in France.
That's an amazing story about his whole thing, because he was a Stoic philosopher, or very heavily inspired by Stoicism in his early life, and he tried to be like hyper Stoic and live that way. And then he had like a mental breakdown from it. I understand he had some sort of crisis, and then he went to France, and just like you just said, and he that was his attempt to kind of get himself right after that misstep with the Stoicism.
The very first work by Descartes is the title of it is typically radically mistranslated. It is mistranslated in English as Directions for the Mind. Mind has nothing to do with what Descartes was writing about. In fact, the Latin word should be translated into English as engine. So Descartes, in his very first work, which is incomplete, it was supposed to be 3 sets of propositions, only one of which was completed. But the directions for the operation of the engine, it's a user's manual for what is no longer a soul, but rather something that has become a machine.
Oh, this is so great. No, I love you, Mark. This is great stuff to talk about. This is what I love. But no, this, because me and Logo are just talking about all this kind of stuff too, in terms of the 20th century and the electric environment, is that this becomes really dominant in how, public opinion is directed, and how, it's definitely, it becomes very much a well-ordered engine, and it's based around measurement of, it's basically like they're trying to create a fake consciousness that through measurement, through these surveys, through opinions polls, through, different kinds of, psychotherapies and sensitivity trainings and, all this, and they're trying to create a mechanical process and keep it going within everyone's minds that's, completely artificial and isn't even...
Well, obviously, the machine metaphor ran out, I guess pun intended, ran out of steam. But then, of course, it was replaced with the computer metaphor. And so overwhelmingly, the dominant form of experimental psychology today goes by the name cognitive psychology.
Yeah. Oh, logo. You guys tell Mark about this. What we were talking about with the computational and this guy that you were.
Yeah. Do you know Minsky, Mark?
Yes, and in fact, I have met him.
Oh man, that must be wild. I went down a wormhole looking into him, and just because he seems like the poster child for this sort of understanding of basically, like, he was like very much doubling down on the notion that like cognition or consciousness is fundamentally like a fraud, and what it really is just like a calculation machine. And he has this model for society, and naturally this like leads him to calculate his way to Jeffrey Epstein's island, amongst other places.
Probably more important than Minsky, but to be sure, the whole AI crowd, particularly the older crowd, fell in with this. But I think forgotten by many is Noam Chomsky.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I was going to ask you about this because I saw what you'd written about Chomsky earlier, and I think that it's like extremely important information that, like, considering like the kind of public stock in Chomsky right now.
Please, you guys gotta let everyone know what you're talking about.
Well, Chomsky is by some accounts the most cited, the most referenced, depending on categories of activist, leftist, anarchist, however you want to identify it. The academic work of Chomsky does not get nearly so much attention. So Chomsky is quite notorious for his political views, but he got tenure at MIT in the 50s, right smack in the middle of all of the excitement and anxiety about these topics, in large part for promising that he would discover a universal grammar for human language. That project, of course, has failed. There is no such thing as a universal grammar, particularly in the way that he is describing it. But why would you want a universal grammar to begin with? That has to be effectively an approach to the topic of a programming language for the human bio-meta computer, however it might be. My particular personal interaction with all of this was through my godfather, Norbert Wiener. My father had gotten a Westinghouse scholarship to MIT in 1941. He arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and actually fairly quickly as an undergraduate associated himself with Wiener's seminars, and then got drafted and went off to the South Pacific. But he came back and wound up being probably one of a small handful of people who were close to Norbert Wiener. I've actually written a fairly detailed history of all of this. Be happy to share with you. It was a speech that I gave at a 2014 IEEE conference on Norbert Wiener in the 21st century. And the title of that essay by me is Wiener's Genius Project. So Wiener was in the midst of all of these characters attempting to apply cybernetics for the purpose of programming humans. He objected strenuously to that entire activity. He got himself completely sideways with the original cybernetics crowd. And then reality intervened on what would otherwise have been an academic discussion. He published a book in 1950, the title of which is The Human Use of Human Beings. he was a notorious, famous figure, and so therefore many copies of the 1950 edition, first edition, were printed. They can be found often cheaply as used books now. One of the people who read that was Walter Reuther, a unusually intellectual labor union boss, the head in particular of the UAW. I believe it was the UAW CIO at that point. And he really took a liking to what Wiener had said and the human use of human beings, and made multiple trips to Cambridge, Massachusetts to meet personally with Wiener. It turns out that he invited Norbert Wiener, who was a short, fat, bald Jewish mathematician, cigar smoking, to be sure, but nonetheless, he was invited to keynote the 1952 UAW union meeting. I believe that invitation is what set in motion what wound up being the FBI knocking on Wiener's door and telling him that he had to immediately drop all of this, cease and desist, no longer agitate people, stop messing with labor unions, who were an important part of the overall Cold War effort. And the threat was that Norbert Wiener and his closest associates, very importantly, not just Wiener, but the whole crew of people around Norbert Wiener, would be called up in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, because at that point in the early 1950s, the only people who were aggressively, publicly agitating against cybernetics were the Soviets. And this was true throughout pretty much the entire decade of the 50s. The Soviet Union viewed cybernetics as a bourgeois plot. Norbert Wiener had no relationship to those people, but because of the overlap between what he was saying and they were saying, the threat was they would be called up as Soviet agents. And in order to protect his colleagues, who were more vulnerable than he was, he decided to withdraw. And from that point forward, he never wrote a significant book. And in fact, it's worse than that. He was ordered to radically expunge the first edition of Human Use of Human Beings. As it turns out, I own Norbert Wiener's personal editing copy, given to me by my father. It's quite remarkable, page after page after page being crossed out, to go through and look at each of the individual items here. But the move towards viewing human beings as computers and then trying to program them through Chomsky, and then trying to set up situations in which they can be engineered, which is a term I would prefer to manipulate and so forth. This was described by my other godfather, the historian of science, Giorgio de Santayana, a Renaissance historian. Actually brought roses to my mother the day after I was born, brought them to her in the hospital. Giorgio wound up writing in this same time period interesting short little essay, which is funny on its own, but key footnote is the denunciation of what were called emotional engineers. I believe that is the term that Wiener and his associates described. So if you happen to go look at the preface to the book Cybernetics, published in 1948, same year I was born, you will notice that it gets more and more strident as the preface continues. And towards the end of the preface, Wiener actually goes out of his way to say he will not work with Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson. He calls them out by name.
These are Boseians,
yeah.
Boseian anthropologists. Worked for the OWI.
These were World War II psychological warriors who had been trained in anthropology and were married to each other until sometime in the late 40s. When I presented my essay, Wiener's Genius Project, at this conference in 2014, their daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, was sitting in the front row. It was quite interesting to watch her face as I went through recounting this history. I believe she, Mary Catherine, had a hand in the hatchet job biography of Wiener, the dark hero of the information age. So there was a fair amount of tension, as you might imagine, in the room.
No, this is a really important kind of subject matter, because obviously the development of cybernetics, it's not a fringe kind of thing that was happening at that time. It's very central, because it's also like, John von Neumann is paying close attention to this, and he knows all about the development of cybernetics, and he's reviewing these books as they come out, and they know each other, and it's a whole thing going on in parallel with what's at Rand Corporation at the same time, when the sorts of things they're working on with their game theories and systems theories, and you get this development of cybernetics, and who does he actually cite as kind of like the patron saint or earliest originator of cybernetics? It's Leibniz. And, what is Leibniz trying to do in the same way is he's also trying to make a, not necessarily universal grammar, but universal language of symbols, of a symbolic, logic that is going to be able to automatically generate knowledge using, kind of hermetic emblems that are,
I think that's a fairly significant misunderstanding of Leibniz.
Oh, go ahead. If you want to, I mean, overall, I mean, I want to get into these ideas of some of these machines and cybernetics, and then McLuhan, and basically, we have all these technologies like you're talking about with, print and digital environments, and these are technological.
Sure.
And they're we have a relationship to them through our consciousness and through the cultural forms that link us to these, and that's a part of like what cybernetics is, and there's a lot of different ways you can sort of go about looking at it. So I want to
let me get to a discussion of this sequence of psycho-technological environments using Leibniz as the entry point. Leibniz is one of these figures who, because he did not, like Kant or Descartes or others, he did not publish his comprehensive system. You then have to scratch your head and wonder, well, why wouldn't he do that? He obviously was surrounded by many other people who did, and he was engaged with some of them in debates and so forth. And the answer was that his purpose was not to leave a completed system for posterity. His purpose was, in fact, to reunite Christendom.
That's one way of looking at it. I mean, you can go ahead and explain, give your whole analysis. But this is, I wouldn't necessarily agree with.
Okay, but that's the only way that history will accurately portray what Leibniz was trying to accomplish. He was a diplomat. He spent a great deal of time in various capitals, working with the heads of state, many of them nobility, attempted to set up in both Berlin and in St. Petersburg rivals to the Royal Society and so forth. So there can be no historic doubt that his occupation was diplomat. But that occupation of diplomat was intimately tied to his recognition of the collapse of Christianity under print conditions. So Leibniz is a fascinating bridge figure who is looking back to a medieval uniformity in the church, noticing the print-driven Reformation that shattered that unity, and therefore trying to, in effect, put Humpty Dumpty back together again. The literature on Leibniz, in English in particular, is remarkably poor about understanding these elements. The English-speaking world, Anglophonic world, has always been hostile to Leibniz, so it's not surprising, perhaps, that Bertrand Russell, representing many generations of the Royal Society, decided to develop the thesis that this was all a fake, that Leibniz wasn't really doing any of these things, but this was just what he had to do to keep his job. That's all nonsense. A woman by the name of Maria Antignoso has published both her PhD thesis on Leibniz's work on the Trinity and a much more extensive work, which is the intellectual biography of Leibniz. That, for English readers, is the starting point of what Leibniz was actually doing. A perhaps interesting alternative view about this, although I think it's consistent with what I just said. More recently, a wannabe screenwriter has written a book entitled The Courtier and the Heretic. And this is a popular work meant to contrast Leibniz, the repugnant, old-fashioned Courtier with his wigs and all the rest of it, with Spinoza, who is the heretic, literally a Jewish heretic, as declared in Netherlands. And so that's a more recent and maybe for some people useful entry point into this, because this is quite complicated. But I think it really is incontrovertible that everything Leibniz was doing from the point that he had studied these medieval texts in his father's library, quite unusual for anybody growing up in that time period, all the way through the end of his life. His one goal was to put Christianity back together again. Needless to say, he failed in doing that.
Oh man, there's it's incredible, this whole project of the 17th century and the development of this, because now we can talk about the Elizabethans too, but from my this Leibniz intellectual biography, the Maria Rosa Antignosa one, I that was my first one that I read. I got a couple of years ago, but and I've been using it a little bit recently, but I actually don't like it very much. I mean, I actually don't think it's a very good. It's excellent that this book was written and that this woman, this scholar, did all this work and put all this together, and she does a lot of great things. But it's ultimately one that I think gets a lot of things wrong philosophically on a lot of specific points. So I don't know about that particular point. I mean, I agree with you and a lot of what you're saying on this point. I'm not. I think there's no reason for us to totally take over the whole episode hashing it out. But it is a really interesting point of what exactly is he doing? Because he does have a universal kind of project that he's working on. Of this is a whole metaphor of the Tower of Babel that is really prominent during the time, and Kircher's.
Yeah, he rejected all of that.
Drawing his etchings about that.
He completely rejected that whole exercise.
Yeah, and there's all these people doing this though. There's another guy, Wilkins, is doing it.
Yeah, I understand, but Leibniz was not doing it. That's what I'm telling you. Leibniz rejected all of those characters.
I know. And Leibniz is, I think he is doing it. He's revising. He has his own perspective. He's revising a lot of this work, but he is really genuinely interested in it. And it does have something to do with what his project is, which is what you're saying of trying to, you can consider it basically reuniting Christendom, but I don't even think that it's not, he doesn't want it to go back to the Middle Ages. I mean, he's thinking about a higher kind of universal, reunification.
No.
That is like Christendom in a lot of ways, but
no, not even remotely. This is really crucial.
No, it's great. I'm not trying to. There's no antagonism on part of this at all.
But be that as it may, let's shift the conversation to these environments and then try to situate Leibniz.
McLuhan, and this is where I don't know a lot because I haven't read McLuhan. Logo made me buy Gutenberg Galaxy, so I have a copy. I'm actually going to maybe just sit down and read that today because this is all definitely interesting stuff. I put it off for too long.
It's like it's the most interesting stuff. I don't know. That was reading a bunch of McLuhan is probably one of the most mind-altering processes I've ever undergone textually in my life.
So maybe you guys can get into this. Something you need to educate me.
So let me try to lay out the basic phenomenon here. It is obvious, I would guess, to most of us, that given the longevity of humanity, wherever we place the origins, it's certainly going to be hundreds of thousands of years ago, and yet modern humans don't behave that way at all. How is that possible? It turns out that Chomsky found himself having to hypothecate a relatively recent and massive mutation, effectively generating a different species in order for it to be consistent with his linguistic theories. None of that is accurate. In fact, biologically, and so one of those PhD programs I described early on that I dropped out of was molecular genetics, and so I'm quite familiar with what's available in terms of understanding the human species biologically and genetically. No massive mutations for hundreds of thousands of years, and yet massive changes in human behaviors and attitudes, as McLuhan would put it. How did this happen? On the first part, it's important to recognize that human nature is inherently highly plastic, to use the modern term. So it is quite possible to try to shape humans either deliberately or simply environmentally. And there are many key breakpoints in these transitions. The author that I would point you to for the oldest neuroanthropological aspect of this is Merlin Donald. Merlin Donald is now an emeritus professor up in Canada. He was a successful academic, rose to high academic, at least administrative positions in psychology at Case Western and so forth. But his key book is the Origins of Consciousness. I'm sorry, the Origins of the Modern Mind, the three phases of cultural evolution. He, in turn, is learned a great deal about this from another author who I'll point to, Julian Jaynes.
Okay, I was going to ask about this. I didn't know if you have read this, but this is one of the great books that I love this book, and this is a book that actually made me start asking a lot of questions about different things and got me interested in all this to begin with.
Julian Jaynes' Origin of Consciousness.
Yep. Yes.
I was Julian Jaynes' last student.
Oh, I didn't even know that. That's amazing.
Yeah. I used to attend these fairly exclusive, I guess, which just meant you had to pay a bunch of money, conferences attended by Freeman Dyson, who has recently died. I considered him something of a friend, was fortunate to have lunch with him in Princeton a few months before he passed. But Freeman is father of Esther Dyson, and Esther Dyson is the one who was conducting these expensive, therefore somewhat exclusive conferences. I sat down next to Freeman one day at the lunch for the conference, which is called PC Forum, and I asked him about Julian, also then at Princeton. He said, Julian's not doing very well. Brilliant man, completely surrounded by people who rejected him and have bombarded him and harassed him endlessly. And it's showing in his health. If you want to speak with Julian Jaynes, I suggest that you get on a train next Monday and take it to Princeton, because I don't know how long it's going to last. In fact, I did that the following week, took a train to Princeton, met him. At that point, he had no students. He'd really been completely sidelined. And so I asked him, is it okay if I study with you? Unofficially. And he accepted that. We went through a number of conversations in Princeton, and then he became so expendable that they violated his tenure and told him to go home.
Really?
And so I spent a weekend with Julian Jaynes at his ancestral home on Prince Edward Island, Canada, a few months before he died. Jaynes was an absolutely fascinating figure. The modern and extended version of that is Merlin Donald. So I'm pointing to Merlin Donald, and as an explanation for how it is that humans who really did begin effectively as monkeys 2.0 then moved through a series of these stages psychologically. He only brings the picture up to the invention of literacy. And that final phase would be, in McLuhan terms, that is the shift from the oral environment to the scribal environment. And this occurs in what many people have referred to as the axial age. It's not the invention of writing, it's the invention of an audience. Writing, which is for yourself, notes on the back of your hand, laws that are written in stone that nobody can read, hieroglyphics that are painted on the inside of pyramids, intended only for the gods. None of that can make the sort of psychological change that literacy did. And there's a vast literature, as you know, on that whole topic. The piece of that literature that McLuhan referred to on many occasions was Eric Havelock's Preface to Plato. It turns out that Havelock had been at Toronto. He did not meet McLuhan there. He left, he went to Yale, and his later book, The Muse Learns to Write, is much more up to date in the sense of now intersecting with McLuhan's work. So that the shift from oral to scribal is something that we see evident in all of antiquity. It is particularly evident in the transition in Greece, from a Socrates who wrote nothing to a Plato who wrote an enormous amount using the voice of Socrates, but still wrestling with this oral to scribal transition. And then in just another generation, we wind up with Aristotle, who is the first, I would say, in that whole milieu, who has come to grips with the implications of this and is not looking backwards and somehow trying to continually refer to the earlier oral environment. Aristotle, importantly, was not Athenian. Athens was a loony bin. And so you wind up with Platonic efforts to changed the order of reality, ultimately expressed in his final dialogue, The Laws. That's all nonsense. And Platonists throughout the ages have continued to fail. And in many ways, experimental psychology is driven by this. I'm reminded, of course, of the
Gestalt, and it's phenomenology, and there's a lot of relationship there.
Yeah, but the abandonment of Aristotle in the 20th century is really quite phenomenal. He wasn't rediscovered until quite late. And so Whitehead's famous quote that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato is a fine description of the electric environment, which we haven't yet gotten to in this discussion. The transition that follows the oral to scribal transition, roughly 500 BC, that, of course, is the transition from scribal to print. And that is the transition that Leibniz straddles.
Yeah.
And one in which Descartes, with his view, replacing the human soul with a machine, he is emphatically in the print world. My guess is that your knowledge of Kant will indicate that Kant was also struggling with these sorts of questions, and I look forward to learning more about that. But
no, and this is exactly a lot of the point of this, the development of this later metaphysics, like Logo. I mean, you've been doing Hegel recently more, and this is exactly like there is this whole deep there's no disagreement between Julian Jaynes and a lot of classical metaphysics in the sense of their awareness of the historical development of consciousness in the way that Julian Jaynes was talking about, and how a transition did happen exactly as you just were describing, Mark, and that Greek consciousness was a whole different animal from what came before. They didn't have any of this stuff. This whole evolutionary model of we got enough density of neurons or something, and it just we're conscious now, and we have these higher.
No, there's no biological change at all. The density of neurons it was the same 200,000 BC as it is today. The biological species Homo sapiens has not gone through any changes in this process. The only thing that's changed is technology,
and everyone accepts it. I mean, me and Logo talk about this all the time about these evolutionary psychology and these kinds of different attempts to do it, right, Logo? I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I was going to say also, this is also comes down to a lot of the political philosophical discussions when it comes down to interpreting Plato, because that's what every one of the great 20th century political philosophers was basically trying to have the definitive take on Plato. And I think that the major axis that you see, especially in the discourse today, is between you can see in the correspondence between Strauss and Kojève, because Strauss is fundamentally holding up Plato's laws as the last word in all of this, and that
correct.
Pretty much everything since then is nonsense.
That's correct.
And he turns the Knight Council in the laws into basically the technocratic state that we have. That's
correct. And Plato corresponds in many respects to the electric environment. So in the sequence here, the handoff, if you will, from the scribal environment into the print environment also has attracted a great deal of literature. Elizabeth Eisenstein's work on this is probably the most thorough in terms of the historic dimensions, but McLuhan's Gutenberg Galaxy is a fine description as well. But that environment also came to a transition in the 19th century, beginning in many important respects. Long before that, these things tend to. I published an essay a couple of years ago with some other folks from the center, and used a illustration from I think a 1921 IWW Wobbly publication. in which there's the quote underneath it is that great events cast their shadow before them. So the transitions are not something you can say this happened on this date, or there are these hard-edged differentiations. They overlap, to be sure.
It happens all over in different, country by country, region by region. It's like,
that's right.
Yeah, it's not these are almost almost, you have to think about more in an abstract sense. It's not.
But the two quotes that I tend to use to describe the transition from print to electric are Nietzsche's 1880s statements about God is dead. Nietzsche, of course, did not mean that God is dead. Nietzsche was in a long line of Lutheran pastors, and went off to his undergraduate years at Leipzig, fully intending to be like his father and grandfather before him. So what he was actually saying, I would suggest, is that the Lutheran Bible is dead. God is dead, I interpret as a statement about environments rather than the superficial. So this is the Gestalt figure ground distinction again.
This is exactly what I sent you a quote.
Yeah,
I sent you a quote, Mark, about this too. This is what I was talking about with that quote about literacy and how everyone learning to read is going to destroy thought. This is exactly what I meant.
Right. The other quote that I tend to use is the Max Weber. So Weber is a little late to the party here, but in one of his last lectures, Sciences of Vocation, given in 1917 in Munich, this is where his phrase, the disenchantment of the world, comes in.
But I want to just, Logo, you wanted to add something here, because you talk about this.
Yeah, I was going to say, another major figure I'd say in that turn is roughly contemporary is Kierkegaard writing the concept of angst, as McLuhan noted, the same year that the telegraph was invented. I always think is a great symbolic representation there. And Kierkegaard also kind of in a same way as being if you're saying Nietzsche saying the Lutheran Bible is dead, that's also pretty true in Kierkegaard, because he has this heavy emphasis on trying to recreate the conditions mentally of early Christianity, as opposed to the sort of bourgeois Protestant Christianity of the time.
It's this is the whole it's the mystification part of it, just like Mark just said. I mean, this is exactly what you the point you try to make all the time.
Yeah.
So well, how could you not be anxious?
Weltschmerz and
if you withdrawn the ground, which in Western civilization, that ground is Genesis. So if you've withdrawn Genesis and you've deliberately insisted God is dead and there's no such thing as a soul, anxiety is the only possible reaction to that. The process that Leibniz had gone through in the 17th century to try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, failing to be sure, only got worse and worse and worse. So by the time we get to the electric environment, replacing the previous print environment, it's now possible to not just worry about these topics, but to state them aggressively publicly. That then leads to a situation, and here's a key notion in terms of this sequence of environments, introduced into our conversation by Marshall McLuhan. So, as Logo knows, and as Kantbot's about to find out, McLuhan was being forced by his reluctant publishers after a hatchet job biography of McLuhan appeared in 1971, declaring that he was a Vatican agent, which was not correct, but it was taken seriously by the publishing world. They turned this back around on him, and he said, understanding media, published in 1964, kind of getting old here. The time has probably come for you to restate all of this in a much more scientific fashion. And so the last decade of McLuhan's life, having a stroke in 79 and then dying in 1980, he spent the entire 1970s working on a project that he did not complete, and in fact was not published until 1988 by his son Eric, who was a friend of mine. Unfortunately died in 2019. Eric wound up publishing Laws of Media. And so, as it turns out, the title, Laws of Media, and the subtitle, The New Sciences, this is McLuhan's somewhat weak and insecure and to some extent driven to distraction for having to transform what he had said into something that was more methodical and, in quotes, scientific. But in the process of doing that, they invented a heuristic called the tetrad. And when I advise people who are trying to discover what McLuhan was actually up to, in many ways, that turns out to be the best introduction. Gutenberg Galaxy and Understanding Media and many of the other books with his name on it, often written by other people under his guidance, can be somewhat daunting because the framework, the analogical framework that he's working with is not very familiar to people. But when he finally found himself being compelled, had his nuts in a vice, so to speak, at the end of his life, to re-express all of this, the ultimate expression winds up producing one extremely important observation, and this is the retrieval observation. So, Logo, I don't know how deeply you've gotten into the tetrad. This may be a topic for another conversation. I run, not that it's doing anything.
Oh no, man, I'm deep in the tetrad. I would note that. I mean, I don't know. We don't have to go all into it, but
no, I mean, we don't have to. We're not talking. There's no like agenda or anything set. As I want to learn about the tetrad, so I don't know. Logo, just go off, man.
Yeah, so it's a way of like interpreting God, what is it? The formal causes, right, of
correct
that spawn from various technologies, and you do this by analyzing, like in the tetrad, there's retrieval, as you noted, which is the last one. There's what you probably, I can't name them off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's okay. What he noticed, and to some extent the history of noticing these things was recounted by Eric in various comments, that there's four operations that are underway simultaneously. And so the object of the tetrad is to try to understand the effects on human beings of artifacts. That in and of itself disqualifies it in many people's minds, who want to believe that they are constructing the world, when in fact the world is constructing them. So the tetrad is a heuristic for understanding how you are constructed by the technologies, artifacts that you habitually use. The four quadrants of the tetrad are enhance, obvious from the meaning. Obsolesce, maybe somewhat less obvious, but it's these are features that kind of swap one for the other, and to some extent could be twisted into aligning with a Hegelian antithesis and synthesis, recognizing here, presuming that Logo is a serious student of Hegel, that he never used those words. In fact, his description is far more interesting, but the way it wound up being reduced.
It's actually like Fichte's, I believe, right? The one who comes up with the antithesis. Yeah,
that's right.
No, this is like, but it's all it's very conditional. This is what Schiller does too. Schiller has, I think, the best way of describing it in Aesthetic Education of Man is that, he understands it, he uses it more in terms of like, okay, there's our perceptual awareness of a thing and our ability to comprehend a thing, and then this aesthetic kind of like merging of them, and then these are three different conditions of sort of our ability not only to like perceive of an object as distinct in the world, but also to like comprehend the object. It's like it's not a physical material process. It's like these are the three conditions working themselves out.
Right. So McLuhan quite self-consciously sets up the tetrad in opposition to all of that. For him, as a devout Latin Mass Catholic, the Trinity has a very significant meaning. And so to allow the Trinity to have been shifted to this pseudo-Hegelian triad was upsetting in its own. But in general, those who imagine themselves to be progressives have adopted some version of this in the way they describe cultural evolution, et cetera. None of that would fly with McLuhan. And so the other two quadrants are the more interesting ones, it would seem. If enhance and obsolesce are antithesis and thesis, then synthesis, this progressive result as described by many others, imagining a heritage that isn't actually there to Hegel. Their synthesis, the result of all of this, is termed reverse by McLuhan. That term for the quadrant reverse is then later revised to the more evocative term flip. And so going through laws of media and looking at various artifacts and looking at how these four quadrants are laid out becomes very interesting. Retrieval is that's the odd man out in all of this. It obviously is not a part of those other triads, and in fact, in some ways is deeply anti-progressive, because what it states is that this process of changes formerly caused in us by the artifacts we use habitually, what he declared was that in the process of doing this, we're going to bring something back that was previously obsolesced. That completely runs away from that triadic sort of configuration. And so in this regard, I want to point to two specific tetrads. So Logo is deeply involved with this, and Katbot is just catching up with some of this. Yeah. But my recommendation is
I gotta learn all about this.
And I'd be happy to do another one of these conversations, and we can include Peter Berkman if you want, who is really probably the best McLuhan scholar we have today. The retrieval quadrant really freaks people out when they try to understand what's going on there. In particular, I will point you to two of the tetrads. The one on television, which is the previous environment, and the one on computer, which is the current environment. The end game, if you will, which would, in this faux Hegelian sense, be called synthesis or progress or evolution, but is called flip by McLuhan. That quadrant for television is called the inner trip. Those are the actual words in the 1988 book, The Inner Trip. That, of course, is Facebook, Twitter, and the rest of what we call social media. That is television that is flipped, making everybody into their own broadcaster. That being the last stage, if you will, of the last paradigm or environment. then needs to be compared with the first stage, the beginning of the paradigm environment that has replaced it. And so then we go to the tetrad, again, as published in 1988 for computer. And we find in the retrieval quadrant something quite fascinating. That, as it turns out, I don't think McLuhan had an opportunity, given that his life was almost over, to focus on this. And we're not entirely sure even where it came from, how he came to understand this, but it's there in black and white. The retrieval quadrant for a computer is perfect memory, total and exact. So here we have a situation where the inner trip is the old electric environment at its extreme and ultimately declining edge. And we have the new digital paradigm, starting with the retrieval of memory. Now, let's loop this back, if you will, to the earlier conversation we were having about faculty psychology. And I would be particularly interested, with your help, when I get a chance to study what Kant had to say about all of this, to see how he would have dealt with the following problem. As Logo knows, McLuhan structured, to the extent that there is a overall structure to his work. McLuhan's PhD thesis was called the classical trivium. The trivium is, of course, grammar, dialectics, and rhetoric. And McLuhan very deliberately, self-consciously identified with grammar against dialectics. So you wouldn't expect McLuhan to come up with a carefully laid out logical outline to what he's saying. He's working in an analogical frame. But nonetheless, to the extent that we can think of this as being systematic, we have two objects to compare here. And they have direct correlation to the inner senses. Now, as I said earlier, the inner senses had been forgotten by and large, not completely, but in the larger public arena, and certainly with most people who think of themselves as psychologists or even writing histories of psychology, they're quite unaware of this. McLuhan's focus was on the external senses. And so he characterized various media environments in their relationship to the five outer senses. Because he was unaware of this very rich discussion, largely this would not have been his responsibility to figure this out, but rather the people that he relied upon. And so the neo-Thomists that McLuhan relied upon, like Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson and so forth, these people did not bring these points forward at all. In fact, in some sense, his earliest Thomist mentor at St. Louis University, a fellow by the name of Bernard Muller-Time, who had been Etienne Gilson's star pupil in Toronto, Bernie Muller-Time, BMT, he published a very important article that I think had a significant effect on McLuhan. And in fact, that article will be a part of this collection that my center is now putting together on the interior senses. And it's titled The Perfection of the Senses. And that perfection of the senses is in one of the four interior senses, inner senses, as we call them. And that's the sensus communis.
Communal sense.
The Latin would imply common sense, but that's not exactly what it meant.
Yeah. This is an important point.
But the three other internal senses are the critical part here. And those are memory, imagination, and the cogitative power. Most importantly, the cogitative power, which relies upon the balance between memory and imagination as the two other critical inner senses. And so if that balance, following now the overall research project of McLuhan, to try to understand the sensory balance provoked in us by communications technologies, if he had been able to go the next step to the inner senses, McLuhan's impact, I suspect, would have been radically different. Maybe worse instead of better, but certainly more complete.
Well, this is why, I mean, I would, you dismissed my favorite inner sense. You dismissed the communal sense there too easily, I think, too easily. I'm just, kidding a bit, but this is, for Kant, or this is like the basis. This is extremely important because this is what bridges these two senses.
No, it doesn't. That's the whole point, is that the common sense does not bridge between the exterior senses and the intellect. It is only the beginning of that bridging. You might describe this to some extent as...
And culture, I mean, culture generally is the bridge overall, but this sense is the basis of doing that. This that's what all culture is based on, is this communal sense.
No, as a matter of fact, it's not. It's all based upon the cogitative power. The sensus communis you might think of as all of the various. Let's imagine we've got a river and a bridge across the river, and many paths that lead to that bridge. And so you've got side roads, you've got all kinds of roads that ultimately have to come together to a common point. That's the common sense, or the sensus communis, rather. But the work of perception has not even begun at that point. Perception requires the other three inner senses. It requires imagination, memory, and the cogitative power. And if I discover, with your help, that Kant has eliminated those.
No. This is, okay. I mean, first of all, man, you're great, man. Talking to you, I love talking about this. So it's not like I'm not like
It's okay.
There's no hard feeling or anything. It's not like this is totally 100% friendly. Our disagreement.
No, that's right. I don't get into. I don't tend to get in arguments with people or tend to get into emotional responses. If I aggressively say no, that's not accurate, I'm not arguing with you. No, I get it. I just want to be clear for your sake too, because I disagree with you, but I totally absolutely respect what you're saying here. That's fine. That's right. We don't know each other, so I could misinterpret. You're right.
But I don't think that Kant is not eliminating these other senses at all. I mean, this is what his theory of judgment is trying to do, is to tie together all of the faculties, using the power of judgment as like the center point, and that power of judgment being our ability to combine form and matter, and to make a thought, to form a proposition, to say anything.
That's intellectual abstraction, and so while there are.
What do you mean? Like the theory is an intellectual abstraction? I mean, yes. Or do you mean that?
No, the idea. Let's put this in McLuhan's terms. What you seem to have just been describing is what we would probably refer to as concepts, right?
Well, that's the whole point, is that the faculty of judgment revolves around doing two things. It has two functions, and one of them is to form concepts. Yes.
Okay. The faculty of the soul that forms concepts is called the intellect.
Yes, versus this is the distinction in Aristotle. I was talking to Peter about this just like 2 days ago. As there's a difference between discursive thinking and passive seeing is what you're referring to, and there's right.
Well, there's further complexities involved because the intellect is not a single monolithic faculty, but rather a combination of faculties itself. But for the purpose of what we're discussing here now, taking all of those faculties of the intellect, that is not where patterns are recognized. In fact, specifically, the capability to generate abstractions and universals, which all of the literature that I've read attributes to the intellectual faculties, that is consistent, I guess, with your reference to these activities as being conscious. My assertion is that the really important work is what is in between the sensus communis and the intellect. This black box, which has been reduced to experimental observations in cognitive psychology, that is the heart of the matter. I'll tell you a little story here.
And I would say, I would say like this has a lot to do with imagination.
Well, that's one of the three. So there are three faculties in there.
Yeah.
By the way, if you kind of want a foundational reference to this, not specifically describing humans, but rather talking about animal souls in general. Aquinas' Summa Theologica, Book 1, Question 78, Article 4, title of which is, Are the Interior Senses Properly Distinguished? So it's for people who just are skimming through the various titles to the questions and articles, it would jump out at you. That specific location is only one of hundreds and hundreds of references to these matters in Aquinas, but it's a good place to start. That details that there are three more interior senses. There isn't one, the sensus communis, which then somehow interfaces to the intellect. No.
Well, this isn't what my point is. This isn't what Kant was saying either. Is that there's.
I have to learn about what Kant thought was in that black box.
Is that he has his theory of concept formation and pattern recognition, and so the whole point of the way that it works for him is that you have your outer sense, and it's impressions are made on it, right, of various kinds, distinct little impressions, and you basically take those. And the imagination is responsible for kind of binding those together, the manifold, the pattern, and representing it to inner sense. The inner sense is as some kind of object. As what in the technical term here being intuition is the word Kant uses to describe such objects.
Okay. What faculty of the soul is responsible then for taking these impressions, which in the classical formulation, the location of those impressions, often called phantasms, those impressions are stored in imagination. Imagination in the classical description of these things is a kind of a memory. It's a memory of images, impressions, etc. Fine up to that point. Now what?
Okay,
what is the faculty of the soul responsible for intuition?
Oh no! It's intuition is not in this sense. Is not activity. Intuition is, the product of the work of the imagination.
Wrong. Exactly wrong.
No, you can't. No. This is you gotta let me explicate the theory here before we can say that it's right or wrong.
No, I can't actually say that. I can actually say that is fundamentally wrong. And I will learn what Kant had to say about this, but let me explain what's going on here.
So the imagination is this act of power that, and to be honest, is this is something that is sabotaging to a lot of discussions. Is that I don't think that Kant has the perfect answer to everything. He's inconsistent about this between the first and second editions of the Critique of Pure Reason about what imagination is. And in the first edition, he says that imagination is, that it's, distinct. It's a distinct power. And then in the second edition, he is conceiving it more as a kind of sense.
Good.
A mode of sensation.
Good.
So, so he...
No, that distinction is a very important one.
Yeah.
And it makes... and so I'm learning something here which will be very helpful. And I'm looking forward to talking about this further. But if we do not... So that sequence may very well have been under the influence of Jesuits, who had such an important role in.
This is something that I'm looking into as well. I mean, this is an important. These are important kinds of developments that go on. And so this isn't like. There's no point in being and acting like, okay, it's my philosopher who's the best, who's going to beat your philosophers. That's So this is the work of the imagination to basically form these intuitions, which are then, they're in, the form of inner sense, which is for Kant time, right? So we have this empirical consciousness, which is in time, which just stretches out as, states of affectation of, basically consciousness being, or whatever you want to call it, some sort of subject is, I guess, more appropriate. Like this, the subject is...
Time comes into the discussion for those. And by the way, the Kant that I have read and the commentary that I've read about Kant often finds it very difficult to identify sources for these sorts of things, and so sources, influences, and so forth. And so you know much more about that. And
what do you mean? It's like intellectual other books that he read, or do you mean sources of the in a metaphysical sense? For
Kant is a metaphysician 2,000 years after metaphysics was established. So in the intervening 2,000 years, a large number of people had something to say about metaphysics. And so Kant's relationship to 2,000 years of discussion of metaphysics is something that interests me. And in particular, I would be very interested in the role Jesuits may have played. As it turns out, these you have exactly described the only two ways to think about this. Is there one blob with multiple modalities, or are there separate and distinct powers? I am very much in the separate and distinct powers view of this.
And this is what the point of, like, when we talk about transcendental, this is the point of what I was asking before, between whether or not you saw it as a first order or a second order kind of distinction between these faculties, is like, because Kant, he basically accepts both of those two positions and doesn't see them as incompatible. I mean, he sees, that you can't divide the soul, in a positive sense into, these different modes. It doesn't, the soul is a unity. But then he also recognizes that there's also, for cognition and for us to be able to perceive and to think and to know things, that you need to have the soul performing different functions. So he's classifying in a transcendental sense what those functions are, but not saying that they're constitutive in a first order sense.
Right. I'm a first order sort of guy.
So you think that the soul does, what that would require it to like have, material existence in order for it to be divided in a way, don't you think?
It does up to a point, and that is in fact what neuroanatomy is all about. The interesting part, however, is that the intellect does not have a corresponding piece of neuroanatomy. It really is only appropriate to think about the intellect in a far more distributed fashion. And so just as the external senses can be traced to specific aspects of neuroanatomy, I think it's quite likely, although I don't know that anybody has done this, that the inner senses can also be traced to neuroanatomy. So I will send you guys another item that will be in our collection. This was published in 1975 by the Warburg Institute in London by a student of Francis Yates. Her name is Ruth Harvey, and the title of her monograph is The Inward Wits. And it's subtitled Medieval and Renaissance Psychology. Warburg, as you probably know, is probably the most, or has been through much of the 20th century, one of the most aggressive research facilities, looking at aspects of all of this, particularly Renaissance.
And this seems like this is 20th century, very this is what people are looking at now, and it's like you think that I'm not saying you personally, I'm saying you generally, is that people would think that hearing about this is like a worlds away from what Kant was doing, but this kind of exact thing was very important to the background of the development of all this.
No, I'm sure it was,
because we're not dealing with neuro psychology and the chemistry or structure of the brain. But
I wouldn't be surprised if we were. I wouldn't be surprised if we were, because in particular, that's the reason why I'm mentioning this. The inward wits, starting with the frontispiece and then throughout, it's filled with drawings of the brain. There was enormous effort over the course of 1,000 years to try to identify the specific neuroanatomical aspects of the inner senses, and in particular, the ventricles, which are filled with cerebral fluid in the center of the mammalian brain. It was around those ventricles, front, middle, and back, that over a very long period of time, people located in material anatomical sense these inner senses. This has not been reinvestigated. In fact, I'm now in conversation with some neuroanatomists who are interested in trying to explore all of this, all of which just simply confirms that modern literature has nothing to say about this, whereas over a very long period of time.
Yeah, this is totally taken for granted all the time, is that the way that people think about this, based on the very limited exposure that they have to any of these subjects in school or whatnot, the way that they think about it is so like they think that everything before, I don't know, a certain point in the 20th century, whatever the date may be, they think before that nobody knew about any of this kind of thing, and that they were all working in the very ignorant and background. But this is as you're just saying now, that is absolutely not true, because even for these discussions were very important, but it was the influence of a guy named Albrecht von Haller, who was a Swiss, physiologist who was working on the nervous system. He's a very important figure in the charting of the nervous system and looking at the function of nervous stimulation and contraction, and that was the immediate background to the development of exactly what we're talking about here with Kant's philosophy, how it developed. So my question about Kant will be,
how did he come down on the dispute between Aquinas and Suarez?
Yeah, I don't know if this is not like you're saying. I mean, this is not something that I even know if it's possible to know if he read a lot of Aquinas or that he was very, because he didn't write a diary. He didn't like make lots of. He didn't write many letters. He, obviously lived in Königsberg for, his whole life.
He didn't really want people to know much about his life, I don't think.
He didn't. I mean, I think that's even a philosophical point about him is that he writes about that in his psychology that we were talking about before, in his anthropologies.
Right. That's why I said, at least my limited investigation of this.
It's very limited what is available to know.
It is that people don't have much to go on.
Yeah.
But I think it may be possible, not by biographical information, but rather sort of by intellectual fingerprints, to at least approach this topic. Francisco Suarez, winds up becoming a pivotal figure because as the Aquinas of the Jesuit order, he very deliberately and specifically goes to second order. He refuses the first order faculty approach and instead goes to various functions. And I think it may be possible to trace something of a pedigree here on the first order and second order dimensions. But we've been at this for close to 2 hours, so let me see if I can sort of wrap up. Then you can decide what to do with the editing and so forth. But
yeah,
if McLuhan was correct that different communications technologies formally cause different biases or balances among the senses, which is at the heart of all of McLuhan's work, beginning with his 1959 study for National Association of Educational Broadcasting, Project 69, which is sort of the culmination of his whole explorations exercise earlier in the 50s. If he is correct that what we should be looking for is a bias, a sensory bias associated with these technologies, and we then add to McLuhan what is missing, which is what happens between the sensus communis and the intellect. Then we come up with something quite interesting, because we wind up with this cogitative power, which is really the critical location for the production of perception. And it has to rely upon memory, which is where time and patterns begin to come into this whole operation. If we truncate that process with imagination, as I think you've been suggesting, and eliminate the or collapse memory and cogitation into imagination. So we're going from separate faculties to functions of one faculty. Then we've lost the ability to make distinctions, and the critical distinction that I'm offering here, as I suggested earlier in the conversation as regards McLuhan's tetrad, the inner trip, which is the final stage of the electric environment, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. That is a massive bias in favor of imagination. It's where conspiracy theories live. It's where propaganda lives. It's where memes live. It's where all of those sorts of things that tend to drive our lives lives. It has been stripped of its relationship to reality, and in particular, its relationship to time. It is far more likely for people to take these images they have and consider them to be eternal, perpetual.
Yeah. No.
We wind up in a world in which racism, justice, equality have been absolutized, as opposed to being merely images. They have been abstracted from their historic basis and made into these free-floating universals. That's what flipped television looks like, as opposed to perfect memory, total and exact, which is how computers are actually organized. Something that I know because of another wayward part of my own career was, in fact, architecting some fairly major commercial computer systems. And so I had to figure out how these things actually work. If the bias in our lives today, and I think this is fairly straightforward to demonstrate, is overwhelmingly towards imagination, ungrounded images, which we're then forced to somehow reconcile these things. Remembering here, of course, that a raster scanned screen, whether it was an old analog NTSC television screen or any of today's flat panels, there actually are no images on those panels, none. They are all constructed based upon the observation that the external sense of sight is easily fooled by flashing lights. This is called flicker fusion. So anybody who's interested in this, of course, can just take out their iPhone, go into the photo app, set the shutter speed to 1/100th of a second, and take a picture of a raster scan screen, television, computer, whatever. If you do that exercise at 1/100th of a second, which is, as you know, is not that fast, people are often using 1/500th or 1,000th of a second to get stop motion. At 1/100th of a second, you're at a speed which is faster than any widely commercially available refresh rates, which tend to be in the 70 to 80K for today's flat panels, and we're all the way down at 30K for a 60 hertz or 25K for a 50 hertz television set. There's no picture there. And so therefore the images which are being poured into our imagination are nonsense. They're not actually images at all. And as a result, the rest of our interior senses now have to try to make sense of that. This is, I suspect, an experience, the television experience, something that would have been fascinating to Kant or Aristotle or Aquinas, because they did not live in that world. They were not surrounded by flashing lights. So they didn't have to deal with the psychological consequences of being immersed in a fantasy world. In sharp contrast to that, the fundamental principles of the inner sense of memory are relationships between images through time, which can then be assembled into perceptions. If you have obliterated, in media ecological terms, if you have obliterated memory and have gone completely into a bias towards imagination, you're screwed. You have lost contact with time, space, reality. And that's exactly what's happened to us until recently. Our view at the center, the work that Peter and I and a bunch of others have been trying to complete here on the inner senses, it is founded on the notion that we are going through a radical rebalancing of the inner senses. I don't know whether first order or second order ultimately matters in those terms. These could be viewed as functions that are being amplified or de-emphasized, but there can be no doubt about it. To the extent that human beings surround themselves with communications devices that remember everything, they will be forced to radically change the internal balance within those inner senses. And so our basic theme here is that this new paradigm, digital paradigm that we're in, has enormous implications in terms of, again, what McLuhan would call behaviors and attitudes. So as important as it is, I'm agreeing with you, we need to understand the electric environment. We need to understand its predecessor, the print environment. But what is happening now in this digital environment is that we are now retrieving the scribal environment. So we're in much the way that the electric environment retrieved orality. Walter Ong, who was a student of Marshall McLuhan's at St. Louis University, famously published in 1982, shortly after McLuhan died, his Orality and Literacy, in which the term secondary orality becomes the leading category, and that describes, I think, quite well the world in which we used to live, the electric world. That does not describe, however, the world in which we currently live, which is probably better described as secondary literacy. So the sorts of things that the two of you have been doing, I believe, are a part of this shift back to literacy, scribal literacy, from the previous orality. And I believe that the kind of negative reaction that each of you have about the 20th century, whether that's something that's you think is captured in the work of Lyndon Larouche, whether you think it's captured in the work of Marshall McLuhan, or whomever, we only have to worry about that in a sort of nostalgic fashion now. These are all exemplary situations, and so therefore we can draw examples from them, which then effectively populate our inner sense of memory, and as we construct pattern relationships amongst these things. So I'm not in any way discouraging studying all those things. All I'm saying is that we are already now 20 plus years into a completely new paradigm.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I think that, it's just, you have a different background of your experience, and also the different sources that you've turned to. I mean, I haven't read McLuhan. I mean, like I said, I'm probably go find my Gutenberg Galaxy and check it out this afternoon. But you have a very a framework that you're working from, and it's not a framework that I have, but I don't think it's a totally incompatible in any way. I don't think that there's a disagreement between us, and beyond a lot of technical, interesting points that I like to explore. I think that's those are great discussions to have. I really enjoyed talking to you about this. I think this was we got into some finer points that people don't usually even consider, and I think my overall takeaway and stuff that my point that I try to make to people is how interconnected all these things are. It's just not like, it's not Aristotle or Kant, and they're you pick one or the other, or it's they're not far away in a different land. It's like this is a continuous process of development and history, of the spirit working itself out, of the soul developing its powers, and it's all connected into the different ways in which we articulate our soul and ourself, and we work it out through all these different cultural forms, and those cultural forms, feedback and affect the development of our subjectivity and our consciousness. And so it's a huge continuous process. My dog is trying to, he's getting a little barky, but we'll wrap it up here. But this is a great conversation to have.
Well, I hope that we can continue this conversation, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that this notion of continuous development is electric thinking.
No, I agree with this point too. And you're the one trying to say all these disagreements, because I think that this continuous development and this historicism is absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, it's, itself something that's part of modern thinking. I mean, it's not universal either.
It is, correct. And my assertion is we're not doing that anymore.
And I'm
It's the end of history, baby.
Open to all types of exploration. I mean, you're not completely free of any lapses or fallbacks into anachronisms. You're not totally digital, my man. We're both trying our best here, and I love it. I love it.
No, I wouldn't claim to be digital. I would only claim to be Scribal.
No, I mean, I loved this conversation. This was great.
Let me explain very briefly what I mean by that.
No. We'll save it. We'll save it for another time, because I have to take care of my dog here, and
Okay, good.
I love the conversation. I want to do another one whenever you're available. Send me some those essays. I'd love to read them, and we'll talk more and do more, and I'll shoot you an email after this. And this has been great, man. Thanks so much.
I'll send you Ruth Harvey's Inward Wits, and then we can set up another call at some point and include Peter Berkman.
That'll be a really good one.
Yeah, no, I love it. This was amazing. Yeah.
Cool.
This was a great conversation. Thanks a lot, Mark.
Great.
Have a great day.
Bye, guys.
Peace.